Hey everyone, Jack here, and today I'm going to be talking about Theater of the Mind in Dungeons & Dragons. So Theater of the Mind is a type of Dungeons & Dragons where you do all of the combat within your head instead of doing it on a grid. I've done Theater of the Mind Dungeons & Dragons for many years myself, and I've only recently started to actually get into using miniatures to represent enemies on the battlefield, and I've always found that Theater of the Mind is a perfectly acceptable way to play, especially when you're just getting into the hobby. Because playing that way makes Dungeons & Dragons more accessible. It allows you to get into the hobby without actually having to spend a lot of money. Like recently, I just bought some dungeon terrain, and I think I spent a little over $300 on getting the terrain and the miniatures, and it is a lot of terrain that I purchased, but it took me a long time to actually justify me buying all that terrain and spending all that money, because I wasn't sure if I would use it all the time or if maybe I would eventually become disinterested in Dungeons & Dragons. But after so many years of actually playing, I've decided that I'm committed enough to playing Dungeons & Dragons that I'm going to spend the money on the terrain. But that doesn't make playing with terrain any better than playing with Theater of the Mind. You usually have to think about where your character is a little bit more when playing in Theater of the Mind than using the miniatures and terrain. Because terrain allows you to see where your character is going to be, whereas in Theater of the Mind, you have to announce where your character is and you have to think about how far away each of the enemies are. But it's not actually that much more work on the DM. You just have to decide where the enemies are going to start from the players and how far that distance is. And then from there, you just have to tell the players that they are 30 feet or 60 feet away from them. I would recommend sticking with distances that are multiples of 30 feet because 30 feet is the average movement speed for a D&D 5e character. And so if you are within a multiple of that, you know that it's going to take the characters 1 or 2 rounds to get to the enemies depending on how far they are 30 or 60 feet away. And knowing that is really the most important thing, because then you can say that the ranged enemies are 60 feet away, and so it's going to take the players 2 turns to actually run up to them, and that the melee units are 30 feet away, and that's only going to take 1 turn to run up to. The only major problem with Theater of the Mind, it doesn't allow for as much tactical placement of the characters. Oftentimes, if you actually visualize the board of what's happening, it's just going to be 2 different groups that are lined up facing each other, almost like Revolutionary War type combat where there's 2 units of soldiers slowly moving towards each other. That's kind of what Theater of the Mind combat ends up looking like, but that's not too much of a big deal. And if you put in enough effort, you can actually work around that. You just have to note when a player is saying that they are going 20 feet to the left of the characters or maybe 20 feet behind. Adding all those extra directions to keep track of might end up being a little difficult if you're just doing it in your head. So I'd recommend going and actually writing out where the players are and where they're moving to. Now, Theater of the Mind is the bare bones version of Dungeons & Dragons combat. As soon as you possibly can, I would recommend getting some sort of grid. It allows for more of that 2-dimensional movement where you have movement in 2 different axes, the X and Y direction, rather than just the 2 groups moving slowly closer together. So when you have the grid, you can have people moving left or right. Keeping track of it on a piece of paper kind of can become a little complicated, but if you have it on the grid, it becomes much easier to see where everyone is. And you don't need to get miniatures for the grid or anything like that. You can just use dice. That's what my group was using for quite a while. We would have like D4s to represent the players and D6s to represent the enemies, and everyone would remember what color dice they were. Usually they would just use whatever dice set they were using, and so they would easily remember. And we picked the D4 because the D4 wasn't very commonly used by them, but you can pick whatever die your players aren't using, such as the D8 or whatever, and that works perfectly fine. The only problem with this is that you actually have to find a way to get a grid paper. You can do something as simple as just taking a blank piece of paper and printing out a grid on that, but I'd recommend you go and purchase any kind of battle mat. They're usually under $30 and they'll last you quite a while. And once you actually get into purchasing the battle mat, then getting a dry erase marker to write on it isn't that much more of an investment. From there, that's really all you need for tactical combat in Dungeons & Dragons. That is the bare bones of what you need. Having the dice to be the miniatures and the dry erase board to be the terrain. That's basically all the benefits that terrain gives you. The only difference is it obviously doesn't look as nice as having little pieces of plastic all over the board where you can see like three-dimensional what the actual terrain looks like, and you can see the broken walls much easier, but that's besides the point. I wouldn't necessarily recommend purchasing terrain if you're a new DM or anything like that. I can't even say I would recommend purchasing terrain for anyone yet, because I haven't played with it quite enough to say that it's actually worth the investment. But maybe in a couple months or so, I will make a new video talking about terrain, and I'll see if owning physical terrain actually benefits my game in a noticeable way. And if it does, I will report back and tell you the type of terrain I purchased, if I enjoy it, or maybe whatever terrain I've moved on to, and I'll recommend it then. But until then, I'm not actually going to recommend anything, because I don't want you to purchase a product thinking that I recommend it and think it's a good way to play Dungeons & Dragons, and in reality, I've not actually played with it enough. When you start playing on a simple grid board, I'd recommend that you start placing the enemies in ways that actually provide tactical advantage towards the enemies, rather than just the line that Theater of the Mind provides. Obviously, with Theater of the Mind, you can be placing them tactically inside your head, but you just have to make sure that you're communicating that to the players and telling them things such as the guards are placed so that they're just far enough apart where if you run between them, you'll get opportunity attacks. But when you actually start placing things on the board, you actually can just see that, and the players will think about that on their own rather than having to be told by you, or have the problem that arises in Theater of the Mind where maybe they'll run past a guy thinking that they have enough room, and then you have to tell them it's an opportunity attack, and they will be like, oh, I didn't know that, so they want to retcon their whole turn, and then it adds like all this unnecessary stuff to the round that's slowing down the game, all because you're trying to describe a very complex battle that's taking place between two groups inside people's heads, which is almost never that effective. When you start placing things down on the grid, you actually have more freedom to just say, this is where the guards are, and then your players will take time to think about how they want to pass by them, and without you having to tell them, they'll see that if they run between them, they'll have an opportunity attack that will spring on them, and so they'll try to avoid doing that, and they'll realize that they have to take out the guards first before they can get through. My major tips when it comes to Theater of the Mind combat is that you should be giving clear and vivid descriptions as often as possible. So you want to be updating the players with any new information that happens when it happens, and you want to make sure that they are constantly reminded of that updated information. You don't want to have it so that a player may be distracted for a second and they miss you saying that a guard moved, and then when they look back, obviously there's nothing to look at, so they don't know that the guard has moved. You want to reiterate any actions that have happened a couple times so that it's drilled into everyone's head, the new positioning of people and things such as that. And when you're describing things in Theater of the Mind, you should try to give as clear and vivid of a description as possible, describing the entire scene, anything around the players that they could possibly be using. Basically, you want to be describing anything that their characters would be seeing. Let's say that they could possibly see a box full of oil in the room. Maybe they could throw that box at the enemies and light it on fire, and that would create a whole new situation, and that would help them win the battle. So you want to make sure that they know that there's a box of oil there, and you want to make sure that you put it into your descriptions as often as possible. Overall, I'd say that Theater of the Mind Dungeons & Dragons can be very fun and fulfilling as long as you keep everyone updated and on the same page, and you make sure you're giving clear and vivid descriptions about the scene and what's taking place. Because as long as everyone knows what is happening around them and there's no contention about that, then Theater of the Mind Dungeons & Dragons can work just as well as tactical combat on a grid. Obviously, I'd recommend buying a cheap grid and some dry erase markers and using dice as miniature, because it's not all that expensive and it really enhances the play of Dungeons & Dragons. I would say that I would recommend a grid over purchasing, let's say, the DM's guide. Because though the DM's guide does provide a lot of information about how to be a good DM and how to create campaigns and settings and stuff like that, a lot of that information can be gotten for free online, whereas a grid provides a noticeable boost to your adventures right away. This is the grid I've been using for my games for many years. It has two sides to it. It has a grass side for like outdoor encounters, and it also has a stone tile type side for indoor dungeon encounters. And I found that it's a very cost-effective grid. Reading the back of the grid's packaging says that it sold for $25 US, so somewhere around $30 is a good price to be picking up your first grid. And if you're like me, you'll end up using it for many years and it will be a worthwhile investment. So if you do get the chance, I'd recommend it. It's not that expensive and it will enhance your games. I think that's all I have for you today, folks. So I hope you had a good time watching this video. And if you have any experience running Theater of the Mind Dungeons & Dragons, leave that down below in a comment and I'll be sure to read as many of them as I can. And if you enjoyed watching this video, can you leave it a like? That'd be a great help. Thanks for stopping by. I hope you have a great day, week, month, and year.